Talk about all of this much more with the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Democratic Congressman Adam Smith of Washington. Congressman, thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks, Wolf.
You're the top Democrat there. You were at that hearing. Were you reassured? Because I know you've had some questions over these past several months.
Yeah, I think the focus is better, and I think Secretary Carter, General Dunford, presented a much clearer strategy. I think it's the communication strategy coming out of the White House, well, frankly, throughout the Syrian conflict, has not been great. There have been things said that have led people to not know exactly what the White House was doing. I think they are definitely getting clearer and focusing on pushing a strategy forward.
Because the communications, the dialogue, as you correctly point out, has been confusing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, today said the U.S. has not contained ISIS. 2 weeks ago, the president, in that interview with ABC News, said ISIS was contained. Secretary Kerry says in a new interview with Rolling Stone, he says the U.S. can defeat ISIS, quote, if we get our act together. I mean, there seems to be a conflicting amount of statements coming out, some positive, some negative.
Well, there's two pieces to this. I mean, first of all, saying that ISIS is contained, I think, is flat wrong. They have reach. They have an ability to spread their ideology and to spread terrorist acts, gosh, over the internet, much less by sending people across borders. They just motivate people in Western countries.
So why would the president say that in that interview, that ISIS contained? Was he being very specific in Iraq and Syria and certain geographic areas? Because the impression was that the U.S. is winning this war.
What the president is trying to do is to counter some of the more extremist rhetoric that's frankly coming from the Republican Party about how, we're all going to die, trying to panic everybody that ISIS is coming, ISIS is here, ISIS is there. He's trying to put it in perspective, and I agree with him on that. I think playing into the fear that ISIS is trying to spread doesn't help. That simply moves terrorism forward. That said, I think you have to be careful about the way you put it. I think Secretary Carter is right. ISIS has lost territory in Syria and Iraq. Then there was just a news story a couple days ago about how defections are starting to happen because the perception is that ISIS is no longer making progress. That said, as we've seen, they can spread terror over the internet. They can spread terror with a phone call. So to say that they're content until they're gone, they are not content.
And Secretary Carter, under repeated questioning, even refused to say the U.S. is winning right now. He said the U.S. eventually will win, but he can't say the U.S. is winning.
Well, that's the wrong question, because you don't really have a metric. What he said was, we are making progress in terms of rolling back ISIS's gains. The Kurds on the ground, primarily in Syria and Iraq, have taken back territory, and that has undermined them. When you have a terrorist organization, as the cliche goes, we need to be right every time. They only need to be right once. So you can't say you're winning until the group is completely gone.
To the critics who say this seems half-hearted, send 50 special operation forces to Syria, maybe now another 200. If you're going to go in there and destroy and defeat ISIS, don't you need to send a lot more than, let's say, 250 U.S. commandos?
And there's where I think the critics are wrong, because what the president is absolutely right about is if this becomes the U.S. military versus ISIS, then ISIS has won a huge, huge victory. They can then portray themselves as defending Islam against Western aggression. The only way we win this war is if Sunnis in Iraq and Syria and everywhere ISIS is defeat ISIS. If it's Western aggression, as we saw in Iraq, we went in, we wiped them out, but with a Western force there, they popped right back up. If they can credibly claim that Western aggression against Muslims is what they're fighting against, then we're never going to eliminate this group. Another one will pop up. So it has to be led by the locals, by the Sunnis in the Arab states, and we have to support that. If we send 30,000 troops in there, we may win in a month, but the terrorism will continue. This has to be locally driven.
The former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, retired General Michael Flynn, he spoke to our own Jake Tapper today, and he made a stunning charge that back in 2012, when the DIA was offering assessments of how ISIS was growing, this is not the line the White House wanted to hear. The president was in the midst of a re-election campaign, and they simply ignored those warnings. Listen to what he said. Listen to this.
I think that they did not meet a particular narrative that the White House needed. The people that were around the president, his sort of inner circle that were advising him, I think advised him incorrectly. I think the narrative was that Al Qaeda was on the run and bin Laden was dead and he was
the election area.
And they were dead and and these guys are we've beaten them.
It's a pretty stunning accusation, especially given the current controversy that the U.S. Military Central Command was forced to tailor its intelligence to be more politically attuned to what the White House wanted.
Yeah, I think Mike Flynn is absolutely wrong. And the evidence is in what the Obama administration was doing in 2012. They were still actively, doing drone strikes. The intelligence was aggressive against al-Qaeda, against ISIS. We were still targeting in, gosh, a dozen different countries. So he's absolutely wrong.
Because he points out the president was calling ISIS the JV team.
Yeah, well, I mean, that, again, the president has said some things that are not accurate. But while he was calling him the JV team, we were actively, intelligence and our defense agencies, targeting them, aggressively going after them, and also al-Qaeda and a variety of different other groups that threaten us. So the notion that the White House, decided in 2012 that this was over and stopped is just totally belied by the facts. The facts that the drone strikes continued, the intelligence continued, the targeting of, ISIS and al-Qaeda and other groups continued.
And what about this current investigation by the Pentagon's Inspector General that the Central Command was forced into sort of cherry-picking or doctoring its intelligence to make it more palatable to what the White House wanted?
Well, we don't have any evidence. I'm familiar with it. We don't have any evidence that that's happened. I will tell you, I've been to Afghanistan and Iraq at least 7 times each. And I talked to one group of analysts, and they gave one picture. I talked to another group of analysts. It went from the CIA to the DIA. There is always differences of opinion. Okay, and frankly, the CIA is always the most pessimistic of the group. The DIA tends to be more optimistic, and this was when President Bush was in charge, as well as when President Obama was in charge. There is no evidence whatsoever that the White House pretended that this threat didn't exist.
And just to be precise, when the president labeled ISIS the JV team, you're saying what?
I don't think that was the correct thing to say.
That he was simply wrong.
Yeah, I think he was wrong, but I also think that what he's trying to do is, look, terror is about spreading fear and making people change their way of lives. I mean, we've had presidential candidates on the other side talk about how we need to, round up all the Muslims, that we need to label. The fear that is being spread by the other side, the president is trying to say, hey, calm down. We are the United States of America. We've got this under control. And I think he's right to say that. I do think some of his choices of words has underestimated the enemy in a way that isn't helpful.
We're going to have a lot more to talk about, Congressman. Stay with us.
Sure.
There's a new report that ISIS is recruiting assets here in the United States on Twitter. Much more coming up right after a quick break.